Rome, September 1986. A woman walks into a hotel lobby near the Pantheon. Honey blonde hair, confident posture, the kind of traveler who moves through a city like she's already memorized it. She tells the concierge her name is Cindy, American, from Orlando. In Rome for the food, the cobblestone streets, the light that turns gold in autumn. She books a room for 2 weeks, pays cash. The concierge has no reason to ask questions. She looks exactly like what she says she is. She isn't. Her real name is Cheryl Bentov. She is an operative of the Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, trained in surveillance, psychological manipulation, and the construction of false identities so complete, so lived in, that the person wearing them begins to believe in them. She is in Rome for one reason: to lure a man into a trap, a man whose conscience had quietly become one of the most dangerous threats Israel had ever faced. That man was Mordechai Vanunu, 32 years old, a former technician at Israel's most secret nuclear installation, and he was carrying photographs. Before we go further, a word about what this documentary is and what it isn't. This is not a celebration of espionage. It is not an indictment of Israel. It is an examination of how governments make decisions when they believe the law has failed them. How intelligence agencies operate in the space between what is legal and what is deemed necessary. And what happens to institutions, to doctrine, to individuals when those decisions are made. The Vanunu operation sits at the intersection of national security, press freedom, nuclear politics, and the ethics of deception. It does not resolve neatly. It was never meant to. What it does is reveal something true about how power works, and about the price paid by everyone inside these decisions, including the people who carried them out. To understand how the Mossad caught Vanunu, you have to understand who he was, and why, after 9 years of silence, he decided to talk. Mordechai Vanunu was born in 1954 in Marrakesh, Morocco, the second of 11 children in a deeply religious Jewish family. His father was a rabbi who ran a small grocery store. The life of Jewish families in Morocco had grown increasingly precarious through the 1950s and 60s. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967. Arab nationalism was rising, and with it, an ambient hostility toward Jewish communities that made ordinary life feel permanently unstable. In 1963, when Mordechai was 9, the family emigrated to Israel, part of a mass Jewish exodus from North Africa. They settled in Beersheba, a dusty city at the edge of the Negev desert, the gateway to Israel's southern frontier. Vanunu's adolescence was shaped by contradictions. He was intellectually sharp, particularly in science and mathematics. Quiet, introspective. His classmates remembered someone who asked uncomfortable questions, who didn't accept answers simply because authority offered them. He completed his military service without distinction, assigned to logistics rather than combat. After discharge, he enrolled at Tel Aviv University to study physics. It was there, in the intellectual ferment of the late 1970s, that his politics began to change. Israel at the end of that decade was a country in the middle of an identity crisis. The euphoria of the 1967 Six-Day War had been shattered by the near catastrophe of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The Begin government's policies toward Palestinians in the occupied territories were generating intense debate among younger, liberal Israelis. Vanunu gravitated toward leftist student groups that questioned the founding myths of Zionism and criticized the ongoing military occupation. He read Noam Chomsky. He read Edward Said. He began to see Israel not as a besieged democracy fighting for survival, but as an occupying power sustained by Western backing and nuclear deterrence. His transformation was not sudden. It was gradual, a slow erosion of the certainties he'd grown up with. In 1976, needing money for his studies, Vanunu applied for a position at a facility outside Dimona. The official name was the Negev Nuclear Research Center. The official purpose was peaceful atomic research. Everyone in Israel understood this was a fiction. Dimona was where Israel produced weapons-grade plutonium, the cornerstone of its nuclear deterrent, the ultimate guarantee that the Jewish state would never face existential defeat. The security protocols at Dimona were absolute. Employees underwent exhaustive background checks. They signed secrecy agreements with severe penalties for violations. They worked in strictly compartmentalized sections, each person knowing only what their specific task required. Documents never left the facility. Photography was prohibited. Casual conversation about work was monitored. The culture of secrecy was not just policy, it was atmosphere. Vanunu was hired as a shift supervisor in the plutonium separation unit. His job was to oversee the chemical processes that extracted plutonium from spent reactor fuel. It was technically demanding work requiring precision and discipline. For 9 years, he performed it without incident. Reliable, quiet, competent. The security apparatus had no reason to doubt his loyalty, but something was shifting internally. The longer Vanunu worked at Dimona, the more troubled he became. He saw himself as complicit in a system that made nuclear war possible. He believed Israel's refusal to acknowledge its arsenal was morally dishonest, demanding transparency from others while maintaining its own strategic opacity. He began to feel that the world had a right to know the truth. He was laid off in 1985 during a round of personnel cuts. The official reason was budget constraints. Some colleagues speculated his political activities had made him a liability. Either way, his access to Dimona was finished. But before he left, he had already made his decision, and he had already acted on it. Sometime in his final months at the facility, Vanunu smuggled in a camera. Over multiple shifts, he methodically photographed classified sections of the plutonium separation plant, control rooms, glove boxes used to handle radioactive material, diagrams on whiteboards, storage containers for plutonium spheres, approximately 60 photographs, images that would allow nuclear weapons experts to assess Israel's capabilities with unprecedented precision. After losing his job, Vanunu drifted. He traveled through Southeast Asia, spent months in Thailand and Nepal, searching for meaning in Buddhist monasteries and backpacker hostels. He converted to Christianity, drawn to its universalist message and its critique of tribal nationalism. The conversion was genuine, not tactical. He was baptized in an Anglican church in Sydney, where he had settled temporarily. But his conscience wouldn't rest. The photographs were with him everywhere, hidden in his luggage, a secret that grew heavier with every passing month. He believed the information belonged to humanity, not to a government that had been lying about its nuclear program for decades. He decided to go public. In August 1986, Vanunu contacted the Sunday Times in London. He chose the British press deliberately. He believed it had the resources to verify his claims and the editorial independence to publish them, despite diplomatic pressure. He flew to London and met with Peter Hounum, an investigative journalist with a record of covering nuclear proliferation. Hounum was skeptical at first. Whistleblowers often overstated their significance. But when Vanunu laid out the photographs, skepticism gave way to something else entirely. The images were authentic. They showed industrial-scale plutonium production far beyond anything a peaceful research program would require. Hounum brought in nuclear weapons experts to analyze the material. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Israel had produced enough plutonium for at least 100 nuclear warheads, possibly more. This was not a modest deterrent capability. This was a substantial arsenal, comparable, in some estimates, to medium-sized nuclear powers. The Sunday Times began preparing the story. The editors understood exactly what they were holding. Publication would confirm what many suspected, but could not prove. It would force Israel to either acknowledge its weapons program or cling to a lie that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. It would alter diplomatic calculations across the entire Middle East. Arab states would demand international action. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Framework, the NPT, would face pointed questions about why Israel had never signed it. The story was scheduled for late September, but Vanunu had made a critical error. He had underestimated the Mossad's reach and its willingness to act preemptively against threats to national security. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Vanunu since his first contact with the Sunday Times. British security services, alerted by Israeli counterparts, had notified MI5 that a former Dimona employee was meeting with journalists in London. The Mossad's London station began surveillance. They identified Vanunu's hotel, tracked his movements, photographed him entering and leaving the Sunday Times offices, and intercepted his phone calls using equipment provided through cooperative British security arrangements. The decision to act was made at the highest level of the Israeli government. Prime Minister Shimon Peres authorized an operation to capture Vanunu and bring him back to Israel. The method would be abduction, disguised as seduction. The operative assigned to execute it was Cheryl Ben-Tov. Ben-Tov's true identity remains classified. Even today, more than 3 decades after the operation, her actual name outside internal Mossad files is not publicly confirmed. What is known comes from Vanunu's own testimony, court documents, and investigative journalists who pieced together fragments of her background. She was in her early 30s at the time of the operation. She had joined the Mossad in the late 1970s after service in the Israeli military. She spoke fluent English with an American accent, the result of either a childhood spent in the United States or intensive training in linguistic immersion programs. She was attractive in a way that didn't draw excessive attention. Blonde, but not striking. Fit, but not conspicuously athletic. She could disappear into any environment. Tourist districts, business hotels, university campuses. Her specialization was what intelligence services call honeytrap operations. Missions that exploit romantic or sexual attraction to manipulate a target. They are among the most ethically contested tools in the intelligence arsenal. A honeytrap requires the operative to become someone else entirely. Not just assume a false name, but construct a false personality, a false history, false emotions, and sustain them under the pressure of real human intimacy. The target believes a genuine relationship is forming. Their defenses lower. They share information. They agree to requests they would normally refuse. And when the operation ends, they are left with the understanding that everything they believed was a lie. Critics have long argued that honeytrap operations cross ethical lines that other forms of deception do not, that they constitute a kind of psychological violation. Defenders counter that intelligence work inherently involves deception, and that the protection of national security justifies methods that would be unacceptable in civilian life. The debate has never been resolved because both arguments contain something true. What is not in dispute is how these operations work in practice. Mossad training for honeytrap missions was comprehensive. Operatives underwent psychological evaluation to assess their capacity for sustained deception and emotional compartmentalization, the ability to feel what is necessary for the operation while maintaining internal distance from it. They studied body language, conversational techniques for rapidly building trust, strategies for identifying a target's vulnerabilities and desires. They rehearsed in simulated scenarios until the performance became second nature. The objective was not simply sexual seduction, though that was often part of the operation. The deeper objective was emotional dependency. The target had to feel that the operative was the only person who truly understood them, the only person who cared. The only person offering escape from whatever loneliness or fear was defining their life. Ben-Tov's assignment was clear in its objective and complex in its execution. She had to meet Vanunu, establish a relationship, convince him to leave London voluntarily, and bring him to a location where the Mossad extraction team could take him into custody. The operation had to happen before the Sunday Times published. It had to appear completely natural, and it had to overcome Vanunu's likely paranoia, because he knew he was handling explosive material, and he almost certainly suspected he was being watched. The Mossad's operational planners chose Rome as the location for the capture. The city offered multiple advantages. It was a major tourist destination where foreign visitors attracted no suspicion. Italian security services cooperated with Israeli intelligence and were willing to look away during sensitive operations. The city had multiple extraction routes: airports, seaports, overland corridors to safe houses in other European countries. And crucially, Rome was romantic. A city where a newly infatuated couple could plausibly decide to spend more time together, disappear into hotel rooms, and ignore the outside world. Bentov traveled to London in early September and established her legend as Cindy, an American from Orlando working in the tourism industry, visiting London before heading to Rome. The first contact happened on September 12, 1986. Vanunu was sitting in Leicester Square, a public plaza in central London frequented by tourists and street performers. He was alone, as he often was, watching the crowds. Bentov approached with the calculated spontaneity of someone who had rehearsed the moment dozens of times. She asked if he knew where to find a particular bookshop. Vanunu, naturally helpful, gave her directions. They talked briefly. She was warm, attentive, casually at ease in a way that invited trust. She mentioned she was leaving for Rome in a few days. Vanunu mentioned he had always wanted to go. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, the initial connection had been made. 2 days later, they met again, this time at a cafe Vanunu visited regularly. The encounter appeared accidental. What a coincidence. I didn't expect to see you again. But nothing about it was accidental. The Mossad surveillance team had supplied Bentov with Vanunu's daily patterns. She knew exactly where he would be and when. This time they talked longer. She described her work in tourism, her love of art, her plans to spend several weeks in Rome researching hotels and restaurants for a travel company. She asked about his life. Vanunu, starved for human connection after months of isolation and secrecy, opened up. He told her he was working on a project that had consumed most of his time, that he felt lonely in a city as large and indifferent as London. Bentov listened with apparent empathy. She touched his arm briefly when she laughed. She held eye contact just long enough to signal interest without appearing aggressive. When they parted, she suggested they have dinner before she left for Rome. The dinner was September 15th. Bentov wore a dress that was elegant rather than provocative, suggesting sophistication over overt sexuality. They ate at an Italian restaurant, a choice that reinforced the Rome connection. Over wine and conversation, the evening became intimate. Vanunu spoke about his disillusionment with Israeli politics, his conversion to Christianity, his feeling of drifting without purpose. Bentov responded with fabricated vulnerability. She spoke about her own search for meaning, her dissatisfaction with shallow relationships, her sense that most people never revealed their true selves to anyone. The performance was flawless. She created the illusion of deep connection, two lonely people recognizing each other in a crowded world. By the end of the evening, Vanunu was in love. When Bentov mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he should come visit her in Rome, that she knew wonderful places tourists never found, he agreed almost immediately. The decision was exactly what the Mossad had planned for. Vanunu was isolated, vulnerable, desperate for warmth after months of paranoia and secrecy. Bentov offered escape. She represented beauty, spontaneity, the possibility of a normal life beyond the weight of what he was carrying. His vigilance, already eroded by loneliness, collapsed entirely. He told Peter Honum he was taking a short trip to Rome and would return before publication. Honum was uncomfortable. He advised Vanunu to stay in London, to wait until the story ran before traveling anywhere. But Vanunu, intoxicated by the promise of romance, dismissed the concern. He flew to Rome on September 18, 1986. He did not know that the woman meeting him at the airport was not traveling on her own passport, that the hotel she had booked for them had already been assessed for operational security, that a team of Mossad agents was in position across the city, waiting. He did not know that the most consequential decision of his life had already been made for him, made the moment he sat down in Leicester Square and gave a stranger directions to a bookshop. Rome was everything Bentov had promised. The city in late September carries a particular kind of light, warm and unhurried, the tourist crowds thinning, the streets reclaiming something of their own rhythm. For Vanunu, arriving from the grey anxiety of London, it must have felt like surfacing. He had spent months under the pressure of a secret that was simultaneously liberating and crushing. The photographs, the Sunday Times, the knowledge that Israeli intelligence was almost certainly looking for him. And now, suddenly, Rome. A woman who seemed to genuinely see him. The illusion of a life that was still possible. Bentov played the days carefully. She was not rushing. She understood the psychology of the operation better than Vanunu could have imagined. A honey trap that moves too fast creates suspicion. The target needs to feel that the relationship is unfolding naturally, that they are making choices, not being steered. So she gave him Rome first. They visited the Borghese Gallery. They walked the Campo de Fiori in the morning when the market was still running. They ate at small restaurants away from the tourist corridors, the kind of places that suggest someone knows the city well and wants to share it. She was warm, occasionally vulnerable, always present in a way that made Vanunu feel, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was not alone. He called Peter Honum from Rome. Everything was fine, he said. He would be back before the story ran. He sounded relaxed. Honum was not reassured. What Honum didn't know, what Vanunu didn't know, was that the clock was already running. The Mossad extraction team was in place. The operational window was narrow. The Sunday Times publication date was approaching, and the question was no longer whether to act, but when the moment was clean enough to move. The capture happened on September 30th, 1986. The details of what occurred that evening come from Vanunu's later testimony and subsequent legal proceedings. Bentov had spent the day with him in Rome, another carefully constructed ordinary day. That evening, she suggested they go to her apartment. She had taken a flat in the city, she explained, rather than staying at the hotel. More comfortable, more private. Vanunu agreed. The apartment was a Mossad safe house. When Vanunu walked through the door, the operation ended and the abduction began. A team of agents was waiting. He was restrained, sedated, and removed from the premises. Within hours, he was on board an Israeli cargo vessel in the port of Civitavecchia, bound for Israel across the Mediterranean, unconscious, in the dark. The entire sequence from first contact to extraction had taken 18 days. Bentov's role was finished. She disappeared back into the architecture of the Mossad, returning to a life that has never been publicly documented. Vanunu would not see her again. He would think about her for decades. What happened next was not a quiet resolution. It was the beginning of a much longer and more complicated story, one that the Mossad, for all its operational precision, had not fully anticipated. Vanunu was brought to Israel and held in secret detention. The Israeli government confirmed his capture only after reporters began asking questions, which they did almost immediately, because Vanunu had managed something extraordinary in the brief window before his sedation. As he was being transported through Rome, he pressed his palm against a window of the vehicle and scrawled in marker on his hand the name of the port, the date, the word underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. A photograph of that message, taken by a bystander who did not understand what they were seeing, eventually reached journalists. It was a small act, desperate and improvised, but it pierced the operational secrecy the Mossad had constructed. The world now knew Vanunu had been taken. The Sunday Times published its story on October 5, 1986, 6 days after his capture. The photographs ran. The expert analysis ran. The conclusion was unavoidable. Israel possessed a sophisticated, large-scale nuclear weapons program. Not speculative, not alleged, documented. The story landed with the force of a confirmed detonation. And then something unusual happened. The world absorbed the revelation and largely moved on. To understand why, you have to understand the political context of 1986. The Cold War was still structuring global priorities. The United States and Soviet Union remained the dominant frame through which nuclear issues were interpreted. Israel was a strategic partner of the United States, embedded in a security relationship that Washington had no interest in destabilizing. The Reagan administration was not going to demand that Israel sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Arab states condemned the revelations, but had limited institutional leverage. The International Atomic Energy Agency issued statements. Diplomatic cables were exchanged. And then, with remarkable speed, the international community reached an unspoken consensus. This was something everyone would acknowledge and no one would formally pursue. Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity, the deliberate refusal to confirm or deny possession of nuclear weapons, had always been understood by the major powers as a kind of open secret. What Vanunu did was force that secret into the open. What the diplomatic community did in response was demonstrate that open secrets, once confirmed, can still function as secrets if enough parties agree to treat them that way. The IAEA did not initiate a formal investigation. The United States did not condition its aid to Israel on nuclear transparency. European governments issued measured statements that carefully avoided demanding specific action. The architecture of deliberate not knowing held, even after the photographs proved there was nothing left not to know. This was not simply hypocrisy, though it was partly that. It was also a rational calculation. Pressing Israel on its nuclear program carried significant risks, destabilizing a key regional ally, creating pressure for other Middle Eastern states to pursue their own deterrence, undermining the bilateral security arrangements that had taken decades to construct. The cost of confronting the reality was higher, for most governments, than the cost of accommodating it. Vanunu had believed that revealing the truth would change the truth's consequences. He was wrong about that. Truth, in geopolitics, does not automatically produce accountability. It produces a new set of calculations about whether accountability serves anyone's interests. Israel tried Vanunu in secret. The proceedings were closed to the public and to international observers. The charges were espionage and treason. In 1988, he was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison, 12 of which were served in solitary confinement, one of the longest solitary confinement sentences in Israeli history. The conditions of his imprisonment became, over time, an international cause. Human rights organizations condemned the length of his solitary confinement as a form of cruel and unusual punishment. Amnesty International designated him a prisoner of conscience. Journalists and activists documented the psychological deterioration that prolonged isolation produces. The erosion of the ability to orient oneself in time, the fragmentation of routine cognition, the physical symptoms that emerge when human beings are denied contact with other human beings for years at a stretch. The Israeli government's position was consistent. Vanunu had committed an act of treason that endangered national security. The severity of his punishment reflected the severity of what he had done. The solitary confinement was justified on grounds that contact with other prisoners might allow him to transmit additional classified information. Critics found this argument difficult to credit after the first several years. Whatever additional secrets Vanunu possessed were almost certainly obsolete by the time a decade had passed. The solitary confinement, many argued, had ceased to be a security measure and become a punishment, a signal to anyone else who might consider a similar disclosure. Vanunu himself, in communications that periodically reached the outside world, was consistent about his motivations. He did not regret the disclosure. He believed he had done what was morally required. He expressed no bitterness toward Bentov, or toward quote, _0__, as he still referred to her in some accounts, in terms of her being a woman who had deceived him. His bitterness, when it surfaced, was directed at the institutions that had imprisoned him, and at a world that had received his information and declined to act on it. The honey trap operation itself, its design, its execution, its success, became a case study in intelligence training programs around the world. Not because it was the first of its kind. Honey traps have been a tool of statecraft for centuries. The Soviets used them systematically during the Cold War. The Chinese intelligence services have employed them extensively. Virtually every major intelligence agency has run operations that exploited romantic attraction to compromise targets. But the Vanunu operation became notable because of what it achieved, how cleanly it achieved it, and how thoroughly the details eventually became public. Intelligence analysts studying the operation identified several factors that made it succeed. The target was psychologically primed. Vanunu was isolated, ideologically conflicted, and emotionally starved. He had spent months operating under extreme stress, carrying a secret with enormous implications while navigating the uncertainty of whether the Sunday Times would actually publish and whether Israeli intelligence was closing in. The person who offered him warmth and normalcy didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to arrive at the right moment. The operational planning was precise. The Mossad surveillance of Vanunu in London gave them detailed knowledge of his habits, his movements, his psychological state. Bentov's cover story was tailored specifically to his vulnerabilities. The Rome connection, the tourism industry, the presentation of a woman searching for authentic experience and meaningful connection. Nothing was improvised. Every element was designed. The timeline was disciplined. 18 days from first contact to extraction. Long enough to establish genuine emotional attachment. Short enough to execute before the Sunday Times ran the story. The operational window was identified and honored. And critically, the operation exploited a blind spot that nearly every human being carries. Even someone who knows they are being watched, even someone who intellectually understands that they might be targeted by an intelligence service, wants to believe that the person in front of them is real, that the warmth is genuine, that the connection is not a calculation. Vanunu's paranoia was real. His loneliness was stronger. But the operation also raised questions that intelligence professionals have debated since, questions that do not have clean answers. The ethical framework of honey trap operations assumes that the ends justify the means, that the manipulation of a target's emotional life, including the simulation of romantic intimacy, is an acceptable cost when national security is genuinely at stake. The Mossad's position, then and now, is that Vanunu posed a direct threat to Israel's strategic deterrence capability, and that neutralizing that threat was a legitimate act of statecraft. The countervailing position is more complicated. Vanunu was not a spy in the traditional sense. He had not sold information to a foreign government. He had not sought personal profit. He had given information to the press, motivated by what he understood as a moral obligation to transparency about weapons that could end civilization. Whether or not one agrees with his decision, the category of actor matters. The methods deployed against an ideological whistleblower raise different questions than those deployed against an agent in the service of a hostile power. There is also the question of jurisdiction. The operation to capture Vanunu was conducted on Italian soil, without the formal knowledge or consent of the Italian government. Italy's security services may have cooperated informally, but the abduction of a foreign national on Italian territory by a foreign intelligence service using drugging and physical restraint violated Italian law, regardless of what that individual was alleged to have done. The Israeli government has never formally acknowledged the operation's details, and no Italian legal proceedings resulted from it. But the principle it established, that intelligence agencies can operate with impunity on the soil of allied nations if the political calculus makes formal objection inconvenient, has never been resolved. This is not a question limited to Israel. Intelligence agencies of every major democracy have conducted operations on foreign soil that were technically illegal under the laws of the host country. The broader framework is one of tolerance and selective blindness. Allied governments generally overlook each other's most sensitive operations, provided the political cost of formal acknowledgement exceeds the benefit. The Vanunu operation was unusual only in how thoroughly it was subsequently documented. Vanunu was released from prison in 2004, having served his full sentence. He emerged into a world that had changed dramatically since 1986. The Cold War was over. The Middle East was in the middle of a new and violent instability. The nuclear non-proliferation framework was under pressure from multiple directions: North Korea, Iran, the aftermath of the Iraqi and Libyan programs. But the conditions imposed on his release were severe. He was prohibited from leaving Israel, prohibited from speaking to foreign nationals without prior authorization, prohibited from approaching embassies or consulates. The restrictions were imposed by administrative order, without criminal charge, and were renewed repeatedly over the following years. Vanunu's lawyers argued they amounted to a continuation of his punishment beyond the legal sentence the court had imposed. Israeli security authorities argued they were necessary to prevent further disclosures of classified information. The restrictions generated ongoing international protest. In 2007, Vanunu was arrested and convicted of violating them for speaking to foreign journalists. He served additional time. The cycle of restriction, violation, prosecution, and imprisonment repeated itself. By the early 2000s, he had spent more years under Israeli legal constraint than he had lived freely since his arrest. He converted fully to Christianity and stated publicly that he no longer considered himself Jewish. He applied for permission to emigrate multiple times. He was denied multiple times. The Israeli government's position was that he remained a security risk regardless of how much time had passed, that the knowledge he possessed, even if largely obsolete, could still be contextualized and analyzed by foreign intelligence services in ways that might yield operational information. Critics saw something else in the persistence of his confinement and restriction. A message, not to foreign intelligence services, to Israelis, to anyone inside a sensitive institution who might be weighing the cost of a similar decision. The message was not subtle. The cost would be everything. The cost would be your freedom, your identity, your ability to build a life. The cost would be decades. The Vanunu case illuminated something about the relationship between nuclear deterrence and democratic accountability that governments prefer not to examine too closely. Nuclear deterrence as a doctrine depends on a specific kind of opacity. The value of a deterrent is partly in its credibility. An adversary must believe you will use it. But credibility in a democracy carries a cost. Democratic publics, if fully informed about the nature and scale of their government's nuclear capabilities, might demand accountability. They might ask questions about the decision-making processes that control these weapons. They might object to the fact that the most consequential military capability their government possesses exists entirely outside the normal structures of parliamentary or congressional oversight. Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity was designed precisely to avoid this accountability problem. By neither confirming nor denying the existence of nuclear weapons, Israel preserved diplomatic flexibility, avoided formal obligations under the NPT, and insulated itself from domestic debate about its nuclear program. The policy had served its purpose for decades. What Vanunu did was attack the ambiguity directly. He provided evidence that transformed a known secret into a proven fact. The Israeli government's response, the abduction, the secret trial, the 18-year sentence, the restrictions on his speech and movement after release, was the cost it was willing to impose to signal that ambiguity would be defended regardless of what the public record showed. The question this raises is not specific to Israel. It is a question every nuclear state has implicitly answered, and answered the same way. The oversight mechanisms that govern other instruments of state power do not govern nuclear weapons with the same transparency. The people who control these weapons, and the doctrines under which they would be used, exist in a sphere of decision-making that is almost entirely insulated from public accountability. Citizens of nuclear states have, in effect, extended unlimited trust to a very small number of people on the most consequential question imaginable. Vanunu believed this arrangement was wrong. He believed the public's right to know outweighed the state's interest in concealment. His reasoning was coherent. His method was arguably illegal. His punishment was arguably disproportionate. And his central claim, that Israel possessed nuclear weapons, was confirmed by every credible expert who reviewed his photographs. None of that changed the outcome. Not the diplomatic calculus, not the legal proceedings, not the duration of his confinement. Bentov, Cindy, has never spoken publicly about the operation. Her identity, protected for decades by Israeli classification, was partially confirmed by investigative journalists in the early 2000s. She reportedly moved to the United States after leaving the Mossad, built a private life, and has never been legally pursued for her role in an operation that, under Italian and international law, involved kidnapping. Vanunu described her, in interviews conducted over the years, without apparent hatred. He acknowledged that she had deceived him completely, that the connection he felt had been entirely manufactured, that the person he fell in love with in London did not exist. He seemed to understand, at some level, that she had been doing her job, that the institutional machinery that directed her was the true subject of his experience, not the woman who had been its instrument. Whether this understanding constituted forgiveness or simply exhaustion after decades of confinement is difficult to say from the outside. What is not difficult to say is what the operation accomplished and what it did not. It stopped Vanunu. It prevented him from conducting interviews that might have amplified the Sunday Times story. It demonstrated the Mossad's ability to project operational power into the heart of Western Europe. It sent a signal, clear, durable, intentional, about the price of nuclear disclosure. What it did not do was restore Israel's nuclear ambiguity. The Sunday Times published on schedule. The photographs ran. The expert analysis confirmed the arsenal's scale. The secret that Vanunu had carried across Southeast Asia and through the streets of London and into the newsrooms of Britain was out. It had been out for months before the Mossad reached him. The operation, in other words, was a tactical success deployed in service of a strategic objective that had already been lost. This is not an unusual situation in intelligence work. Agencies sometimes execute operations that are operationally clean and strategically futile. The machinery of covert action generates its own momentum. The decision to act had been made. The operation was executed flawlessly, and the thing it was designed to prevent had already happened. The questions the Vanunu case raises have not been answered in the decades since. They have, if anything, become more pressing. In a world where nuclear weapons states continue to resist full transparency about their arsenals, where whistleblowers who disclose state secrets, whether about nuclear programs, surveillance capabilities, or the conduct of military operations, face prosecution under laws designed for traditional espionage, where intelligence agencies operate across national boundaries with largely informal constraints on their methods, where the line between protecting national security and suppressing democratic accountability has never been clearly drawn. The Mossad's operation in Rome was not an aberration. It was a precise expression of how powerful states respond when they believe their most sensitive secrets are at risk. The tools were seduction and abduction. The justification was national security. The authority was granted at the highest level of elected government, and the outcome, a man's freedom, traded for decades in exchange for a secret that was published anyway, sits unresolved in the record of how democracies govern themselves. Mordechai Vanunu believed the public had a right to know what its government was capable of. Shimon Peres believed the state had an obligation to prevent that knowledge from reaching them. Both men were operating from coherent positions. Both men had authority behind their decisions. And the question their collision leaves open is one that no court, no treaty, no intelligence doctrine has ever definitively answered. When a democracy keeps a secret from its own people, a secret about weapons that could end civilization, who, exactly, is it protecting?